Chapter 12, The Schoolroom. While Dr. Carey was making repairs on the car, Stuart went shopping. He decided that, since he was about to take a long motor trip, he should have the proper clothes. He went to a doll shop where they had things in the right size for him and outfitted himself completely with new luggage shirts, suits, and accessories. He charged everything and was well pleased with his purchases. That night, he slept at the doctor's apartment. That morning, Stuart started early to avoid traffic. He thought it would be a good idea to get out on the road before there was too many cars and trucks. He drove through Central Park 110th to 110th Street, then over to the West Side Highway, then to the North Sawmill River Parkway. The car ran beautifully, and although people were inclined to stare at him, Stuart didn't mind. He was very careful not to press the button which had caused so much trouble the day before. He made up his mind that he would never use that button again. Just as the sun was coming up, Stuart saw a man seated in thought by the side of the road. Stuart steered the car alongside, stopped, and put his head out. "You're worried about something, aren't you?" asked Stuart. "Yes, I am," said the man, who was tall and mild. "Can I help in any way?" asked Stuart in a friendly voice. The man shook his head. "It's an impossible situation, I guess," he replied. "You see, I'm the superintendent of schools in this town." "It's not an impossible situation," said Stuart. "It's bad, but not impossible." "Well," continued the man, "I've always got problems that I can't solve. Today, for instance, one of my teachers is sick. Miss Gunderson, her name is. She teaches number 7 school. I've got to find a substitute for her, a teacher who will take her place." "What's the matter with her?" said Stuart. "I don't know exactly. The doctor says she may have rhinestones," replied the superintendent. "Can't you find another teacher?" said Stuart. "No, that's the trouble. There's nobody in this town who knows anything. No spare teachers, no nothing. School is supposed to begin in an hour." "I will be glad to take Mrs. Gunderson's place for a day, if you would like," suggested Stuart agreeably. The superintendent of schools looked up. "Really?" "Certainly," said Stuart. "Glad to." He opened a door of his little car and stepped out. Walking around the car, he opened his baggage compartment and took out a suitcase. "If I'm to conduct a class in a schoolroom, I'd better take off these motoring togs and get into something more suitable," he said. Stuart climbed the bank, went into the bushes, and was back in a few minutes, wearing a pepper and salt jacket, old striped trousers, a Windsor tie, and spectacles. He folded his other clothes and packed them away in the suitcase. "Do you think you can maintain discipline?" asked the superintendent. "Of course I can," replied Stuart. "I'll make the work interesting, and the discipline will take care of itself. Don't worry about me." The man thanked him, and they shook hands. 9:15, the scholars had gathered in the school number 7. When they missed Miss Gunderson and word got around that there would be a substitute, they were delighted. "A substitute?" somebody whispered to somebody else. "A substitute! A substitute!" The news traveled fast, and soon everyone in the schoolroom knew that they were all to have the rest of Miss Gunderson for at least a day, and were going to have a wonderful experience of being taught by a strange teacher whom nobody had ever seen before. Stuart arrived at 9. He parked his car briskly at the door of the school, stalked boldly into the room, found a yardstick leaning against Miss Gunderson's desk, and climbed hand over hand to the top. There he found an inkwell, a pointer, some pens and pencils, a bottle of ink, some chalk, 2 bells, 2 hairpins, and 3 or 4 books in a pile. Stuart scrambled nimbly up to the top of the stack of the books and jumped for the button of the bell. His weight was enough to make it ring, and Stuart promptly slid down, walked into the front of the desk, and said, "Let me have your attention, please." The boys and girls crowded around the desk to look at the substitute. Everyone talked at once, and they seemed to be very much pleased. The girls giggled, and the boys laughed, and everyone's eyes lit up with excitement to see just such a small and good-looking teacher so appropriately dressed. "Let me have your attention, please," repeated Stuart. "As you know, Miss Gunderson is out sick, and I am taking her place." "What's the matter with her?" asked Roy Hart eagerly. "Vitamin trouble," replied Stuart. "She took vitamin D when she needed A. She took B when she needed C, and her system became overloaded with riboflavin, thiamine hydrochloride, and even with pyroxidine, and the need for which in human nutrition has not been established. Let it be a lesson for us all. He glared fiercely at the children, and they made no inquiries about Mr. Gunderson. Everyone will now please take his or her seat, commanded Stuart. The pupils filed obediently down the aisles and dropped into their seats. In a moment, there was a silence in the classroom. Stuart cleared his throat, seizing a coat lapel in either hand, and made himself look like a professor. Stuart began. Anybody absent? The scholars shook their heads. Anybody late? They shook their heads. Very well, said Stuart. What's the first subject you usually take up in the morning? Arithmetic, replied the children. Bother arithmetic, snapped Stuart. Let's skip it. There were wild shouts of enthusiasm at this suggestion. Everyone in the class seemed perfectly willing to skip arithmetic for one morning. What next do you study? Asked Stuart. Spelling, cried the students. Well, said Stuart, a misspelled word is an abomination in the sight of everyone. I consider it a very fine thing to spell words correctly, and I strongly urge every one of you to buy Webster's Collegiate Dictionary and consult it whenever you are in the slightest doubt. So much for spelling. What's next? The scholars were just as pleased to be let out of spelling as they were about arithmetic, and they shouted for joy, and everybody looked at everybody else and laughed and waved handkerchiefs and rulers. And some of the boys threw spitballs at some of the girls. Stuart had to climb into a pile of books again and dive for the bell to restore order. What's next? He repeated. Writing, cried the scholars. Goodness, said Stuart in disgust. Don't you children know how to write yet? Certainly we do, yelled one and all. So much for that, then, cried Stuart. Social studies comes next, cried Elizabeth Gardner eagerly. Social studies? Never heard of 'em, said Stuart. Instead of taking up any special subject this morning, why wouldn't it be a good idea if we just talked about something? The scholars glanced around at each other expectantly. Could we talk about the way it feels to hold a snake in your hand and when it winds itself around your wrist? Asked Arthur Greenclaw. We could, but I'd rather not, replied Stuart. Could we talk about sin and vice? Pleaded Lydia Lacey. Nope, said Stuart. Try again. Could we talk about the fat woman at the circus? She had hair all over her chin, begged Isidore reminiscently. No, said Stuart. I'll tell you. Let's talk about the king of the world. He looked around the room, hopefully to see how the children liked the idea. There isn't any king of the world, said Harry Jameson in disgust. What's the diff? Said Stuart. There ought to be one. Kings are old-fashioned, said Harry. Well, all right then. Let's talk about the chairman of the world. The world gets into a lot of trouble because there is no chairman. I would like to be the chairman of the world myself. You're too small, said Mary Bendix. Oh, fish feathers, said Stuart. Size has nothing to do with it. It's temperament and ability that count. The chairman has to have ability, and he must know what's important. How many of you know what's important? Up went all the hands. Very good, said Stuart, cocking one leg across the other and shoving his hands in his pocket of his jacket. Harry Rackmaker, you tell us what is important. A shaft of sunlight at the beginning of a dark afternoon. A note in music. The way the back of the baby's neck smells if its mother keeps it tidy, answered Henry. Correct, said Stuart. Those are important things. You forgot one thing, though. Mary Bendix, what did Harry Rackmeyer forget? He forgot ice cream with chocolate sauce on it, said Mary quickly. Exactly. Ice cream is important. Well, now, if I'm going to be chairman of the world this morning, we've got some rules. Otherwise, it would be too confusing, with everyone running every which way and helping himself to things and nobody behaving. We've got to have some laws if we're going to play this game. Can anybody suggest any good laws for this world? Albert Fenderstrom raised his hand. Don't eat mushrooms. They might be toadstools, suggested Albert. That's not a law, said Stuart. That's merely a bit of friendly advice. Very good advice, Albert, but advice and laws are not the same. Law is much more solemn than advice. Law is extremely solemn. Anybody else think of a law for the world? Nix on swiping anything, suggested John Pulowski solemnly. Very good, said Stuart. Good law. Never poison anything but rats, said Anthony Bernesky. That's no good, said Stuart. It's unfair to rats. A law has to be fair to everyone. Anthony looked sulkily. But rats are unfair to us. he said. Rats are objectionable. I know they are, said Stuart, but from a rat's point of view, poison is objectionable. A chairman has to see all sides of the problem. Have you got your rat's point of view? Asked Anthony. You look a little like a rat. No, replied Stuart. I have no more point of view of a mouse, which is very different. I see things whole. It's obvious to me that rats are unprivileged. They have never been able to get out in the open. Rats don't like the open, said Angus Birdtesca. That's because whenever they come out, somebody socks them. Rats might like it out in the open if they were allowed to use it. Any ideas for laws? Agnes Birdtesca raised her hand. There ought to be a law against fighting. Impractical, said Stuart. Men like to fight. But you're getting warm, Agnes. No scrapping, said Agnes timidly. Stuart shook his head. Absolutely no being mean, suggested Mildred Hoffenstein. Very fine law, said Stuart. When I am chairman, anybody who's mean to anyone else is going to catch it. That won't work, replied Herbert Pendergast. Some people are just naturally mean. Albert Fenderstrom is always mean to me. I'm not saying anything it'll work, said Stuart. It's a good law and we'll give it a try. We'll give it a try right here and now. Somebody do something mean to somebody. Harry Jameson, you be mean to Catherine Stableford. Wait a minute now. What's that you've got in your hand, Catherine? It's a little tiny pillow stuffed with the sweet balsam. Does it say, for you I pine, for you I balsam on it? Yes, said Catherine. Do you love it very much? Asked Stuart. Yes, I do, said Catherine. Okay, Harry, grab it and take it away. Harry ran over to where Catherine sat, grabbed the little pillow from her hand, and ran back to his seat, while Catherine screamed. Now then, said Stuart in a fierce voice, hold on. My good people, while your chairman consults the book of rules. He pretended to thumb through a book. Here we are, page 492. Absolutely no being mean. Page 560, nix on swiping things. Harry Jameson has broken 2 laws, the law against being mean and the law against swiping things. Let's get Harry and set him back before he becomes so mean people will hardly recognize him anymore. Come on. Stuart ran for the yardstick and slid down, like a fireman coming down a pole in a firehouse. He ran toward Harry, and the other children jumped up from their seats and raced down the aisles and crowded around Harry, while Stuart demanded that he give up the little pillow. Harry looked frightened, although he knew it was just a test. He gave Catherine the pillow. There, it worked pretty well, said Stuart. No, being mean is a perfectly good law. He wiped his face with his handkerchief. For he was quite warm from the exertion of being chairman of the world. It was taking more running and leaping and sliding than he had imagined. Catherine was very much pleased to have her pillow back. Let's see that little pillow a minute, said Stuart, who curiously was beginning to get the better of him. Catherine showed it to him. It was about as long as Stuart was high. Stuart suddenly thought that the fine, sweet-smelling bed would make for him. He began to want the pillow himself. That's a very pretty thing, said Stuart, trying to hide his eagerness. You don't want to sell it, do you? Oh, no, replied Catherine. It was a present to me. I suppose it was given to you by a boy you met at Lake Homtog last summer. It reminds you of him, murmured Stuart dreamily. Yes, it was, said Catherine, blushing. Ah, said Stuart, summers are wonderful, aren't they, Catherine? Yes, and last summer was the most wonderful summer I have ever had in my life. I can imagine, replied Stuart. You're sure you wouldn't want to sell that little pillow? Catherine shook her head. I don't blame you, replied Stuart quietly. Summertime is important. It's like a shaft of sunlight. Or a note in music, said Elizabeth Akerson. Or the way the back of the baby's neck smells if mother keeps it tidy, said Marilyn Roberts. Stuart sighed. Never forget your summer times, my dears, he said. Well, I've got to be getting along. It's been a pleasure to know you all. Class is dismissed. Stuart rode rapidly down the door, climbed into the car, and with a final wave of his hand drove off into a northerly direction, while the children raced alongside and screamed, Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. They all wished they could have a substitute every day instead of Miss Gunderson.